Philosophers.
Philosophers.
All right, David. What are we doing this week?
Well, I'd like to talk about why we believe things. The nature of how we come to believe things. Are beliefs a choice, or is there no choice in the matter, and our choice in what to believe is an illusion?
This kind of harkens back to a previous episode where we discussed free will a bit, I think.
Right. The argument can be made that believing something is an action, and thus the arguments of free will apply to belief.
Okay.
But we feel, sort of a little bit different about our beliefs. Well, because the thing about free will is we're talking about, in free will, we're asking the question, are you in control of your choices? Right. But here, we're going to get just a little bit more nuanced and ask, do you have the choice of what to believe, even within that paradigm, even if you don't have control over your choices?
Okay. So I think we should do a quick recap on the fact that it's, at the very least, undetermined whether free will exists. I mean, we've discussed it before, but for the sake of, if you've not been entertaining that subject, that would
go watch our episode on free will.
You should go watch our episode on free will first, because it's definitely a prerequisite. And but if you haven't, I think you at least need to be at a place where you have not already decided one way or the other, or if because we're gonna end up entertaining both outcomes right now anyway. I think that would be our due diligence here. So, are there any other axioms, any other observations that need to be taken into consideration before we fork here?
I guess not.
Okay. If there are, I'm sure we'll come across them. So let's split the instance. In one instance, say free will exists. Okay. And in the second instance, free will doesn't exist, and you behave due to how would you phrase it? You are a causal outcome of all previous effects, or all other causes, or things that have acted upon you in your past, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's go with the first one we've laid out, which was in the realm in which free will would exist. Can you choose what you believe?
Well, I guess I'm already taking issue with this because we have to make presuppositions about how free will exists.
But here's the thing. To me, how it exists is irrelevant for this discussion. It's just if you can conceive of what free will as we've laid it out before, and as the way most people commonly believe that it exists, if they do believe that it exists, can you then choose what you believe? Do you what do you think?
So, I still want to say no. Because even if you have the freedom to make choices about your actions, you don't have like an action that you can perform. Like you don't have direct control over your mental faculties. That is an involuntary thing. Like if someone says something that let's say is very inflammatory to you, then you're going to react in a way that corresponds with that. Even ignoring the physical actions, you're going to feel an emotional response to that. Now, what you choose to do as a response to that in this paradigm can vary because you have free will, but you have no choice but to feel the emotional response. I would like to submit that being convinced of a thing is a type of emotional response. You have heard something or discovered something for yourself that for some reason that you don't understand, you find convincing. You have decided that this is reasonable.
Okay. So essentially,
of course, I just said decided there, so I just stepped all over myself.
You kind of did, but I get what you're getting at. Essentially, I think you're kind of hinging back to the topic, the nature of belief. Belief is the belief itself, which we've kind of we've covered this as well in one of our earliest episodes, actually. But believing something itself. And we are in the argument we had there. If I remember correctly, it's been quite some time. Was believing something is a feeling. It's not a rational process. However, the argument we had was, does the feeling of what you believe matter, or do the actions that are yielded because of the belief, which are choices, which if you believe in free will, or they are things that you can be held responsible for, do they actually dictate what you believe? Because one can make the argument that if you act out of accordance with what you claim to believe, then we should look at what you've done. We should look at your actions to determine what you believe as opposed to what you say you believe. Because we cannot look into your feelings and see what you feel is right, or what you feel is true. And I think that's why in a realm in which free will exists, even if you can make the claim that free will exists, that doesn't necessarily dictate that beliefs can be chosen of free will necessarily. Otherwise, that would also dictate that you would have an unprecedented level of control of yourself to change all future behaviors by setting essentially a precedent in your mind.
Right, basically, because you'd have to have direct control over your own psychology.
Yes.
Which seems like it would create infinite regress at some point.
Yes.
Because how are you like your psychology informs how you make decisions or what decisions you make. So how can you make a choice about the choice making system?
Right.
At some point there's a concrete system that makes choices.
Exactly. Okay, so even in the realm of free will exists, if we allow the claim to be taken as true, you could still the only way you could say that you then had a choice over what you believed was having complete control over your psychology as well, which you would have to accept that as well if you believed that a person had absolute free will. And at that point, you kind of hinge on being a god of yourself in that way. And if you have complete control over your psychology, then you kind of become omniscient about yourself as well. Like, those are kind of other things that you would become fully aware of. And at that point, we're kind of wandering out of what most people would consider to be a conscious human. At that point, you've kind of developed a super consciousness, which, funnily enough, to kind of poke on the lost in the woo, is actually a religious belief that is something that can be achieved. But now we're going to have to step into empirical, science to test it, which we're not about to do on a podcast. I would say there's a second reality that exists as well, and that is of the things that you can... Okay, let me posit something as well. If you have never entertained the notion of an omniscient being, for example, if that concept has never been introduced to you and you had not come up with it some logical way, can you hold a belief about it?
No, but I think that's a little bit out of scope. I don't think that the claim that one chooses one's own beliefs is also claiming that you can choose to believe something, to believe an idea you've never entertained before. That just seems like a given, really. That if you have never heard of a thing, you can't believe in it.
Right. But what I'm trying to get at, though, is I'm trying to link together, though, maybe this will need to wait to the second case, but I'm trying to link together the fact that you are not omniscient. Therefore, the fact that acknowledging that by not being aware, if you agree that there are things that you aren't aware of and you do not have a belief about that thing, that is a causal relationship that exists as well. Now, granted, I don't think that they may be delineated from one another, but by the nature of what you can or can't have a belief about may speak to, and it may be fallacious and you can call me on it, but I think it might speak to the fact that you also cannot choose what you believe, but that's in the second topic.
I think a better example of what this claim is really supposed to be about, Joe, I am secretly a billionaire.
Okay.
And I'm living out here to maintain the facade that I'm not a billionaire. And beyond all reason, I've just decided to broadcast this over the internet.
Okay.
While on our show here, because I'm coming clean now. I'm tired of the facade. It's all over. This is the last episode of Fauxlosophers because I'm about to go move to paradise. I'm finally done putting it up. Do you believe me?
I don't know.
You don't know if you believe me.
Exactly. Because
if I provide you no further information, do you believe me?
I don't know. And that's another thing too. I don't necessarily think that beliefs are binary as either. I think there's the gray area of the...
Sure, okay. Do you hold a high degree of confidence
No.
that this is true?
Well, that's the thing. I am still unsure because, for example, there are multiple factors that I haven't quite equated yet. For example, one factor is maybe you've never given me a reason to... And this is for the sake of the hypothetical. Realistically, right now, me sitting in this chair, I don't believe you. Because you led into it as a hypothetical, right? That gives me enough evidence to suggest that maybe that's not true and tip the scale. But if you just came
I
up
never
to
told you it was a hypothetical.
Your tone indicated it was hypothetical to me. But anyway, but say you had just walked up to me and just said it in the middle of a podcast, in the pre-show, for example, not having any there is no other context other than you just said, I'm actually a billionaire, and this will be our last episode because I'm about to move off to Paradise, Nevada, and live a life in Vegas. Okay. Just assume what I assumed you meant by so you said Paradise, but whatever. I'll link the See What You Agree video below, whatever. I would, that those are things that weigh into the consideration is, well, you've never given me a reason to think of you as dishonest. You didn't say it in a way that seemed like a joke, so that outcome is unlikely. But at the same time, the likelihood of that being the case, both of the rarity of billionaires, and furthered by the rarity of billionaires your age, and even further, the rarity of billionaires living normal lives, the unlikeliness of the scenario also weighs in as well. So for me, I wouldn't have a high degree of confidence that you were in fact a billionaire, for example.
Right.
But I also wouldn't have a high degree of confidence that you were not a billionaire, even though those are mutually exclusive seeming outcomes.
So, but Joe, you have control over your beliefs. So just believe me.
I can't. Okay, here's the thing. I can't just believe you, but I can behave as though you were telling the truth.
Correct.
And I think that's why people get it different.
You can assume and go along with it, but you can't make yourself genuinely believe it without further convincing.
Exactly.
Right. You're gonna have to see me actually go move to Paradise because I told you I was going to.
Right. And in our last...
Or show you my bank account balance or whatever.
Yeah, I need, proof. And that's another thing, too, is in our last episode, we kind of hinted on this as well, of I can behave as though I absolutely don't believe you. Even in the face of evidence, I can still behave as though I still don't believe you, and the evidence is insufficient.
Now, here's something.
It goes both ways.
Here's something that occurred to me, though, that... let's take the case of something like willful ignorance, which is a totally different can.
Ooh.
But and so without going too deep into the philosophy of willful ignorance and whether it's okay, we can, suppose you tell me something that I find very upsetting and I don't want to believe it. Okay? In this case, I'm sort of making a choice because I don't want this thing to be true. Okay? So, however, okay, and to further this, the place I was trying to go with it, I can, after you're done telling me this thing, and when I'm alone and considering it, because that's normally how this goes, I can try to rationalize it away. For instance, I can try to I can try my best to think of other things which contradict what you said, that and so that I can persist in my belief otherwise. This, I suppose, to some extent, could be called choosing not to believe it. But the thing, suppose, hypothetically, I can't come up with a way to rationalize it. This, it just flies too much in the face of something else. Now what? Can I really choose not to believe it? At some point, I submit, there is something that you can hear about a thing. A prerequisite here is the thing has to be true for this quote unquote theorem that I'm coming up with to work. But in the situation of a true thing, there exists something about it that you can hear or discover for yourself that will convince you of it, and you cannot reconcile your contradictory beliefs. Well, obviously you can't do that because they're contradictory. You can't. You can no longer make yourself hold the contradictory beliefs, and so you are convinced of the new thing.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think we've kind of wandered into our second hypothetical, which is free will doesn't exist. But more importantly, I think it's easy to, at this point, kind of accept, once you delineate how people behave from what they believe, I think it's a lot easier to delineate free will affecting beliefs, for example. We'll get into an instance in which that becomes entirely problematic later on, but for the case that you've laid out, I would say there are things that definitely exist in this hypothetical, that exist in other hypotheticals parallel to this one, that you cannot make yourself not believe. Even if, like, for example, if you hold a belief prior and I instruct you, okay, to prove that you can choose that you've believed this thing, I need you to choose that you don't believe it now. Because if you can switch, you can just switch back later if you choose to, right? Like, that would be a good, but you would enter a paradox in that case, I think. We're walking on paradox territory, which is a good thing to find, because once you've entered paradox territory, there's something heavily wrong with the scenario. For example, if the claim would be made, like in your hypothetical, to let me recap, you give me two beliefs to entertain. One I've held before as a truth, and then another one that conflicts. But I have, no matter what I do, I cannot dismiss the second truth, and then therefore I result in cognitive dissonance. And there are levels of cognitive dissonance, the deeper levels of which you cannot rationalize out without literally maybe entering a psychological state of delusion. And for those who don't enter that state, you essentially come out of it regardless. And it doesn't feel like a choice at that point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think one other thing I'd like to bring up about the conditions for being convinced. One problem with that is that you might be incapable of perceiving the thing which would convince you. For instance, say you were colorblind, and I was trying to convince you that something was of a certain color, or that something was multicolor, but they appeared the same color to you. They appeared single toned to you. It may be impossible for me to actually prove this to your satisfaction, and you will go on not believing me because your senses have told you otherwise. I can think of some other...
Or people born blind.
Sure.
You know, imagine explaining something that is unable to be touched. If they're limited to that sense, you know, how do you show that to them? Like, for example, color can't necessarily be touched, right?
Right.
And not only that, but for most people, even if you have all 5, 6, 7, whatever, however many senses we're up to now, when we're talking about things on a subatomic level, I can't show that to you. I can show you a representation that might be convincing, but if you truly understood the topic, you would know that the representation is imperfect and honestly probably inaccurate, you know.
Well, sure. Well, but the thing is that we can, you know, with the thing of subatomic particles, there are other experiments that we can do to demonstrate that they exist, or that at least the model in which we assume they exist allows us to make predictions.
Sometimes we can't. Like, there are still things out there that we are trying to come up with ways, for example, to demonstrate whether they exist.
Well, right,
or
but
not.
this is the cutting edge of science.
Exactly.
And things at the cutting edge of science are not things that we necessarily believe.
We don't, but there may be some that do. Like, there has to be some degree of belief in, like, for example, the math that proves that something should exist there. For example, if we didn't have a high enough degree of confidence to believe in the mathematical model, for example, why do the experiment in the first place? So there are those who do hold, or at least entertain with a higher degree of confidence than others, that the thing exists. But you can hold a higher degree of confidence without committing to saying something you believe that it exists. But even then, you know, going back to what we had discussed originally when discussing beliefs, it is okay to hold a false belief. That is fine, as long as when confronted with evidence to your satisfaction, you change it, because beliefs are mutable. You know, that's another axiomatic basis that needs to be established as well, is that's pretty obvious to most people once you lay it out, but it's not consciously considered most of the time, and that is beliefs are allowed to change, because they do all the time. And if you could not, then you know, indoctrination would be the only way to learn anything, and would be way more effective than it already is, which is very effective. So let's go ahead. I think we've gone to a good place, and kind of jumped the scope for whether assuming free will exists and then assuming free will doesn't exist. I think to beliefs, it's easy now to be able to accept that free will doesn't exist, at least in the case of belief, because of the implications that would also logically need to be accepted if you did try to hold both beliefs. Those being that beliefs hinge on feelings of correctness as opposed to conscious decisions. Delineating, and a mitigating factor for that is the ability to delineate the way you behave from what you believe, because you can behave out of accordance of what you believe, for example. That's another...
Right, because I can, you know, I can consciously and affirmatively, you know, decide to fall backwards as if there were a cushion behind me, knowing that there's not.
Yeah, or a much easier one that's probably way more practical. You can hold the belief that telling a lie is something that you shouldn't do, but you'll still tell a lie. That's acting out of that's a moral belief. That's not a factual belief, but I think, does it matter? Do moral beliefs and practical, realistic beliefs, like things having to do with the nature of reality, for example, that are much more hard, do they matter? Are they different? You know? Because, for example, I think holding a more moral belief, for example, the values that's what we call them, of saying, you know, lying is wrong, okay? But if you behave, you can force yourself, if you believed in free will, to act as though that weren't true and tell lies all the time. But you can still hold the feeling that it's wrong and feel wrong every time you do it.
Right.
And that's where, even if you did believe in free will, you can hold your free will belief, even if it's fallacious or wrong, about actions and decisions. But I think then at that point we need to ask the question, is believing even an action at that point? Or is belief a condition or state of being? Like, for example, getting sick isn't an action. You can perform actions that would lead to the state of sickness, but you don't.
And as a result of being sick.
And as a result of being sick, yes. But you can't necessarily act on behalf of.
I cannot like will myself into sickness.
Right, you can't. Yeah, exactly. Just like you can't will yourself into health either. Right. I think beliefs.
You can't will yourself into believing something
exactly
that you don't think is true.
Beliefs exist much more along the lines of states or conditions as opposed to actions. I think would be a lot easier way to frame it. I think if we treated them more like that, that clears up a lot of logical inconsistencies that might be had around belief. Because once you adopt it under the framework of a condition, and you treat it as such, I think things become a lot cleaner. Because, for example, conditions can change outside of your control, just like your beliefs can change outside of your control. And for those who would still hold that free will exists, they could say that, well, I can do things to encourage beliefs. For example, if you go to church, you can continue to go to church or get more involved in your church to reinforce your beliefs. But there is an action that doesn't have to do with the belief necessarily that encourages itself. Or you could begin reading texts that directly contradict your belief to weaken your belief. If at that point it's agnostic. The actual belief and whether or not you have the actual free will of your action doesn't matter. In either scenario, you can draw a relationship between the choices or the effects of what you're doing to your beliefs. I think we can reach that place if you accept looking beliefs like conditions or a state of being as opposed to a choice. And so I think that's a good place for it. I'm trying to think of, is there a scenario where that may not be the case, though? And I'm having a hard time coming up with one. I think if anyone who's listening can come up with one, I'd be actually really interested in hearing about it, because that's, I think, something I would like to entertain is whether or not an example of where your beliefs being treated as a condition or being treated as a state of being brings up some weird inconsistencies. I'd love to entertain those. So, all right, philosophers.
Very short one this
week. Good work. Yeah, we're only 30 minutes in, but
yeah.
I do think we should backtrack a little bit though and talk about some other things that have to do with beliefs as well. Something that we brought up. I think we danced around perhaps a paradox when we were entertaining the idea of the free will of belief. And that comes into the fact that you're talking about beliefs. Okay? So, for example, if you have free will and you can, regarding your beliefs, for example, can you then choose to no longer have the free will about your belief? Because in order to believe you have free will, if you have free will and can choose what you believe, then you can then choose whether or not you have that same free will, right?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
Because if all we have assumed is that you have free will to choose your beliefs, you can choose not to believe that you have the choice over your beliefs, but you can't choose not to have the choice in this case.
Right, but in a realm in which all belief, because I think if you choose whether or not you have free will, sorry, that sounds fallacious. That's actually kind of wrong. But in the scenario in which you have free will, does that even include things like I choose not to have control over this belief and just allow it to change by its own state? can both of those things exist at the same time? Having the state of being able to choose your free will and then choosing not to exercise it, would your belief change as though it were under the second system of free will exerting over your beliefs isn't a thing and they're causal? Would that assume in this realm of you only have free will, or you have free will over your beliefs? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, I get what you're saying.
Or is that a non sequitur?
Well, it seems a little bit incomprehensible, to be honest.
Well, but we're entertaining the hypothetical,
yes.
so it's okay for it to not make sense in reality. But that might be evidence to the fact that. But then again, just because we can't comprehend or understand doesn't mean it's incorrect.
Correct. So, like, to me, this Would
it be better to frame it in an example?
Sure.
Okay. Let's frame it in an example for the sake of argument. Let's do one of the easiest ones. God exists, and no, I'm kidding. That's actually would make things way more complicated. The Earth being the center of the universe.
Okay.
For example, say that is a question that is posited in the realm in which you have free will, A, and B, because you have free will, you also can extend that free will and control to your beliefs. Okay? So we've set the scene.
Okay.
I can then choose, in this scenario, whether or not I believe that is true or not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? We're all good so far, right? Now, that all seems logically consistent in this realm, for now. Okay? So let's keep all of the framing the same in the example, but I posit a different question. I posit the question about the nature of free will and beliefs. Okay? So I'm introducing an inductive system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, to reiterate the framing, free will exists, A, and free will extends to the choice in your beliefs, B.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I posit the question. Your free will, you have free will and can decide what you believe. That is the question. Now, having the ability to exercise your free will over it and having the ability to control what you believe, can you negatively confirm the same posit that allows for the scenario?
Yes. I think it is conceivable that you could, under these assumptions, choose not to believe that is the case.
Okay.
It would still remain reality under this assumption that you do choose that which you believe, even if you believe otherwise.
Okay. So now that we've entered the second level deep of I in reality have choice, and I in reality have over my beliefs, and I in reality have free will, okay? But I don't believe that, okay? I have to believe something else. Or do I?
No.
Okay, so in either outcome, I would argue that it's the same, okay? Now we bring back the argument over, is the Earth the center of, we bring back the question of, is Earth the center of the universe or not, okay? Now a person who has chosen that they don't have free will over it, and they don't have the ability to control what they believe, how do they address the question?
So they would of course believe or not believe the claim.
But would it be because of their free will or not?
It would be because of their free will. It would have to be because we've made that assertion.
Okay. So then I guess
they would make the choice of whether to believe it while not acknowledging that they made such a choice.
Exactly. Now then therein lies the question, A, can you unknowingly make a choice?
Yes.
Like that, which you can, right? But to further specify the question, can you unknowingly make a decision? Can you unknowingly make a decision? Oh, this is hard. I'm trying to think about where I want to go with this and clarify it. I don't know. Maybe I'm trying too hard to pick the argument in a favor of one outcome or not. So you essentially then can knowingly be ignorant. is what I'm trying to get at.
Mm.
I know it's hard because this is not what we believe, but I'm trying to hold it together in logical consistency.
Yes, you can knowingly be ignorant.
Because you know that you've made the choice before. The first choice in accepting whether or not you have free will.
Okay, it depends on what you... Okay, now I'm going to pick on what you mean by ignorant here. Because, okay, an example that I think we can all agree on is that we all know that there are things about the universe that we don't know. So we are knowingly ignorant about those things.
Right, but in this case, it's a choice to be ignorant.
So, can you know that you have made the choice to be ignorant? Is that the question?
That's the question.
Yes.
But but by the nature of knowing, can you be ignorant? Or is because we've changed scopes that it's okay?
Yeah, because at this point, yeah. Okay. So now you know that you make choices about your beliefs, and you also know that you have chosen not to acknowledge that. No, this is irreconcilable.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to dig down to. Is there is an irreconcilable
you can't know
paradox.
Both of those. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And maybe someone can provide an instance in which you can, but that's not the point. All it takes is one
contradiction breaks the theorem. Yes.
Exactly, and that's what I'm trying to dig to. Yep. Yeah, and so, but that is hard. That was hard. There's some mental gymnastics you kind of have to go through to see it through that within the framing provided.
I wouldn't call it mental gymnastics because that seems like you're being dishonest.
You are being dishonest, though.
Huh?
You're having to entertain an idea in which neither of us believe.
Well, that's not being dishonest.
That's not being it's not being dishonest, but it's having to...
Because we do that in mathematics, too. It's called proof by contradiction. You assume the conclusion which you would like to disprove, and then take it to where it meets its contradiction. And this proves the contrapositive.
Right, but the method by which people are dishonest is the same method, is a very similar method by which you have to do that. For example, if I wanted to be the most convincing liar in the world, you would use a very similar method because the best lies, so they say, which we talked about this also, shill. We have an episode about honesty, or we have an episode about lying, not an episode about honesty and how they are different topics. But anyway, go check that out if you want to. But if you wanted to be the best liar, I would argue, you would need to, on some degree yourself, either be ambiguous to whether you actually believe it or not, but you can't behave as though you don't believe it, because there are factors outside your control, like your body language, that will give you away. So the best way to tell a lie, that should be a video, the best way to tell a lie, where we actually entertain the idea. Maybe we'll have to get through the ethics on that, and I am jumping on way too many tangents right now. Sorry. But if you were going to tell a lie, and I wanted it to be as convincing as possible, I would have to actually try to work myself into a scenario that I either cannot logically entertain, and because I can't logically entertain it, I can't feel as though it's wrong, and therefore kind of maybe fool my psychology into not exhibiting the same characteristics of knowing something is false, which is why lying about something you don't know about is easier to pass than lying about something you definitely do know about. You know what I'm saying? Oh man, that was hard. That was difficult to get through. But so in that case, I think we can maybe show inductively how the system created by the two axioms that free will exists and that you can exert control over your beliefs cannot exist in that case. I think when you put it through an inductive mill, it doesn't work. It gumps up there. But then the appropriate thing to do then is say, okay, is it the fact that these two beliefs come into contradiction? And if so, can you drop one or the other and then still have and put it through the same system? or a similar framing, can you get something that works? And if they both work independent of one another, then you have a hard time figuring out, okay, well, they don't work together, but they can work independently. You need to change framing. But thus is the job of philosophers, not philosophers. And so I do not feel any such moral or ethical weight to fulfill the argument right now. Maybe? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, we're definitely not obligated to.
Nope.
Although I am now tempted to write down a formal proof of the theorem that
do it.
You don't choose your beliefs. It's not really a theorem. It would be more like a
posit.
Well, no, that's the question. I
It's
don't
an
know what
assertion.
the like generic philosophical equivalent to a theorem is.
An assertion?
But it's more than an assertion. I don't know.
True. Postulate? I don't know. We got into this last week when we were
did.
talking about in logic, what's the formal term for Yeah. But no, that's interesting. But it definitely speaks to how you can I think that this episode so far has actually been a really good example of how you can put an axiom and then a second axiom which hinges on the first axiom through an inductive proof and see what comes out if you follow the logical train.
Right.
And that's hard. I mean, I struggled doing it and constructing the experiment, if you will, on the fly, but that's why philosophers, I don't know, I guess get paid to do that stuff. I don't know.
Don't have to.
Don't have to.
Anyway.
Looking at you, Rousseau. But anyway. So in the second, let's do our due diligence on this at least. Let's assume, let's see if whether or not free will exists has any effect, though. If we change the second variable, because we did in the outset break apart into free will exists and free will doesn't exist. Okay, so can we construct a system in which free will does not exist, but you do have control over your beliefs? Because do they hinge on one another?
Right, and I had said at the beginning that even if you don't have control over your decisions, we can still consider the question about whether one decides what to believe.
Right, and that's the thing, is trying to determine the relationship between the two assertions. Because there are such a thing in logic as one-way relationships, where if one assertion is true, the other one has to be true.
I think the question of free will is kind of irrelevant, though.
But that's the point I'm trying to get to, is
yes,
if we throw free will out, do we still arrive at the same problem?
And we do, because now if we assert that one can decide, or that people, well, not that they can, because we're talking in terms of no free will, that people do decide what they believe, then we can construct the same contradictory scenario about deciding to believe that that we can follow the same path and put the go recursively put the belief
in itself
and come up with believing in something that you know not to be true, which is impossible.
Right. And I think that's the point. So it's the fact that whether or not you believe free will exists is actually irrelevant in this case. The hinging factor in this case that determines the truth value is, in the case of our example, not whether or not it is true or not necessarily, is whether or not you can control what you believe. So to take the first example again, say free will exists, but you cannot control what you believe. In just the scenario of what we gave before, let's walk it through real quick just so we can say we've done our due diligence on it, because I feel like walking around the issue might make it more confusing than if we just did it. So, new frame, posit 1, or assertion 1 is that free will exists. Assertion 2 is you cannot control what you believe. So, the Earth, the first question posed under the framework is the Earth the center of the universe? Now, you can control your actions, but the belief that you would have about the question as to the nature of whether it is true or not is indeterminate, right? So regardless of your free will, the outcome will be we could say that any random assortment of people could either come to the conclusion that that is true or it is not true, right? Okay, so then we take the belief itself. Okay, you have free will, and you do not have control over what you believe. The outcome is still indeterminate when posed that question in the framework, because you can exert your free will to say you believe in one or the other, but your actual belief, if you do not have control over it, will yield a difference in outcome from different people. So we might think, or in the hypothetical, and either outcome is still logically congruent within itself. Because, and then if we take the opposite, in which free will doesn't exist, and do the same thing. So framing 2 is free will doesn't exist, and you don't control what you believe. Insert the question of, is the Earth the center of the universe or not? Well, now it's totally indeterminate still. And then you put the same framing in as the question, and the answer is still indeterminate. So because we've reached both indeterminate states, with free will existing as a part of the example and free will not existing as part of the example, they can be canceled out. They can be removed because they don't affect the outcome of the equation. The only thing that's affected the outcome of the equation is whether or not you believe that you can control your beliefs. Ergo, free will has nothing to do with whether you can control your beliefs or not, even though they seem like they would because of the nature of free will as we've understand it commonly. When in actuality, this is more of a control issue, or whether or not you look at believing things as a choice or a state. If you look at it under the concept of it being a state or a condition, you can get indeterminate outcomes, and that's okay in this case. So there, we've done our due diligence.
QED.
Yeah, and there you go. So you're gonna write the formal proof for this now?
I very well might. Actually,
it would be very interesting to see, I think, because I've actually never heard it entertained all the way through. And again, I've never heard someone actually tell me they can choose what they believe in that exact framing. But I think, to round out the episode, because we are pushing 50 minutes now, I would like to, if you don't have anything else to say, which I'm going to open that up, do you have anything else you want to comment about the scenario we've laid out so far? I would like to talk about instances that are this question, but they are guised differently. Namely, faith. Because the concept of faith, as we've discussed before, both in our 4-part episodes on 4-part series on Christianity, and I think we did an episode just on faith in general, did we not?
No, we've only talked about it in the context of Christianity.
But it's a good enough context for now.
Sure.
In those episodes, we had discussed how the definition for faith you can actually boil down to is belief without evidence. How does that fit, though, with what we've just discussed?
Yes. So, I will get around to putting it more succinctly, because I do have a succinct way to characterize faith. So the thing with faith is that one can really only have faith in something if they don't already believe something else that contradicts it. So this is, of course, very easy for, say, a child to be convinced of a particular set of doctrines, or that a God exists or something like that, because they have nothing to contradict it, and so they just take the other person's word for it. That is the convincing that is done. They are still convinced. They aren't out of nowhere deciding to believe this, because, as we discussed already, you can't believe in something you've never heard of before. So in this case, the mere hearing of it is sufficient to convince this person. And so then my succinct characterization of faith based on this is that faith is just a nicer sounding word for gullibility. That at the mere at the mere face of hearing a concept, one believes it. This is gullibility, and that's basically what faith is.
Right. And so, oftentimes, however, I think to put this in context with what we've discussed as well, people will say that I choose to believe in deity or in religion. Insert your preference here. Oftentimes, the debate occurs around the lack of evidence, the nature of faith itself. However, what we've discussed is the nature of choosing that belief itself. And that's one thing I feel like doesn't get discussed as much. However, I think is an equally valid way of addressing the question of faith as well. Like when you call faith into question, instead of questioning maybe, well, faith is dumb because you don't have evidence, and that's why. And then you go down the rabbit hole of, well, we believe all things all the time without evidence, and I have free will to believe this or not, you know. Instead, I think as we've demonstrated here, it's a lot easier to maybe enter a realm where you have to use formal logic when you call into question the ability to choose. Because most of the time, not always, but most of the time, well, I can't even say most of the time. There are times where the nature of free will is introduced with faith because faith hinges on free will as well, when that is maybe, by what we've discussed today, not accurate. And in the context of the person who holds the religious belief, if in their set of axioms hold as well the idea that you can choose what you believe, which in not epistemic, what's it called?
That might be the word you're looking for.
No, it's not. It's to spread word. What's that called? It's an E word. Evangelistic. In evangelistic religions, which is, go out and preach the word to the masses, right? The whole concept of evangelistic religions, which isn't just Christianity, it's any religion that goes out and seeks to convert. That whole point of doing that hinges on whether or not people can choose what they believe in a large way. And so I think that would be an interesting discussion to have with a person who held a religious belief that was evangelistic and see what they had to say about it and see maybe if they have some reasons that we cannot conceive and maybe see if there's something about that we haven't seen the side of yet. But as for now, I'm actually pretty satisfied because we actually did some formal logic today. Philosophers First only took 35 episodes, but we finally got here to do some real philosophy. And I don't know if we can call ourselves philosophers anymore, but I don't know. But that's a practical example of how this argument and process can be used in a discussion. Is anytime you find yourself, saying faith guises the set of axioms in a convenient package that's easy to sell or to proselytize. But when you break it down, there are base components like taking two of those axioms, which are free will and the concept of you can choose what you believe, and showing how they are not congruent, even though they seem so much like they should be by the nature of free will. But it actually is showing that the act of believing is not a choice. And so even if you had free will, it's not something you can control. Because, an easy way to show that is to say, oh, you have free will, right? Which means you can control what you choose, but you also can't just change the weather at your will. Just because you have the ability to choose doesn't mean you have the ability to control.
Right.
They are not they are not they are exclusive from one another. So I think that's something that can easily be accepted, but then once you start there, which is something that's easy to accept for someone who might disagree with you, you can then walk it down through there and see how where if any there is some fallacious logic that what we've laid out. So
right.
Well, I'm actually kind of sad that episode went by so quickly because I really enjoyed that. But I feel like if we were to try to force it any further, we would be beating the dead horse. So, we need to do a state of the podcast at some point because I feel like we're we were over halfway through our first year goal of, to give full context, Dave and I, when we set out to do this podcast, we had decided that one of the goals we had set for ourselves was to do 52 episodes in the first year of doing the podcast.
I thought it was 50.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. To do 50 episodes. And we are at 35, which means only 15 to go. And we started the podcast in November?
I think like right at the beginning of October.
Right at the beginning of October. So I would say that having recorded 35 episodes, we were actually on schedule to hit that goal and maybe even exceed it, which I'm excited about. Because outside of things that we cannot control, like how many people listen or how much funding we would get from an outside source necessarily, one of the things we could control is at least producing the content. Because at 50 episodes, that's 50 hours-ish. And I think we would both get the warm fuzzies for actually doing what we said we were going to do. But that being said, once we hit that goal, it's time to reevaluate. And that's one thing we kind of left open looking at our plan is we talked about introducing recursion loops, and some we have kind of ad hocly integrated. For example, the audio quality has improved greatly, both due to our individual abilities, David's ability to edit the audio, and financially we were able to afford better equipment as well to make his life easier and to increase the effects of what he's able to do. But I think there will come a time where we need to discuss where to go from here. And I don't know exactly how public that conversation will be, but I do think one thing we had also listed is getting feedback. And that's one thing we haven't really requested a whole lot of, not because we don't care for feedback, but because I think feedback is nice, but when you're just trying to figure out what you're doing in and of yourself, it can be derailing to take on too many things at once. And so,
right, it's very important to find out what you're trying to be before, you can accept feedback on that, because you need to have a context of a goal you're trying to achieve. Because if somebody else just starts giving feedback when you yourself don't even know what you're trying to do, then basically they are deciding your direction.
Exactly. And you have nothing to hold it up against to see how it fits, because there is such a thing as bad feedback as well. So that all being said, in a brief little state of the podcast address, I think as we approach our 50th episode, we are going to be having those discussions and we're going to be setting goals for ourselves as well. And I think I can speak confidently enough for myself and say that I think we've got this down pat as far as how we do this. I definitely think there are things we can improve on. But as far as how we improve and what changes we make going forward, I'm sure we will have our ideas, but I think it would also be interesting to hear from those who have actually watched and experienced it, not knowing necessarily what all goes into it on the back end, and just on how it's perceived. So more shilling than normal, I guess, but I really do want to know what other people had to say, because I can't speak for myself, but I can't speak for David, but I enjoy doing this. I assume you do well. You do as well, because you keep doing it.
I keep showing up every week, don't I?
You keep showing up every week, despite my attempts to get you. No, I'm just kidding. But if we're going to do it, I'm under the belief that if you're going to do something, you should do it to the best of your ability and not half-ass anything. So what does that mean is the question. What is doing our best, and what is the best we can do? And to answer that question, we need to agree on a direction. So those will definitely be conversations we'll be having in the coming months, and I wanted to give plenty of time for anyone to hear this episode and provide the feedback. And also just give it time for us to digest the suggestions as well. So I think that's where I'm going to leave the state of the podcast. I just want to say that as of right now, we don't have any intentions to stop. And so if you're enjoying it, you don't have to worry about jumping off a bandwagon or getting left out to dry. But I think a lot of how we'll proceed forward has to do with both the feedback and what we actually are wanting to do with this as we go forward. Because I think we've proven that we can commit to something. And that's the year. At 50 episodes, it'll be about a year. So that's not a small commitment to give to doing something every week, just about, exception of 2 weeks for a year. So where we take that commitment next is going to be interesting, to say the very least. So I think I've done a good job of stretching this to an hour so that I can say that we've done over an hour episode here, and also communicated some very meta information about the podcast. And so to wrap it all up in a bow, we're looking for feedback. You can give it to us in any way it's easiest for you. We have multiple outlets. They're all on our channel. Just let us know, or wherever you're seeing this. And for those of you who are listening to this, there's some method like we're unaware of. Say David ripped you a tape and sent it by carrier pigeon to your house, and you have no idea. You can just one quick Google search for us on like a YouTube. I would say is one of our more prominent platforms. Our contact information is there, and you can always just leave a comment as well. We monitor those fairly frequently. So, all right. That all being said, David, do you have anything to add?
Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.